Thank you, everybody, for joining the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center today for our first annual open house. We are celebrating our first 2 years of research and programming to bring equity to ocean governance. So my name is Constance McBaron. I'm the Communications Officer for Ocean Nexus and for Earth Lab. Both institutions are based within the University of Washington, which is located in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States. And we recognize the numerous tribal communities that have lived here since time immemorial. And we acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Many of you are joining us from different locations, and you will hear from Nexus and Nereus Program researchers who are based all around the world. We encourage all of you to learn about the land you are on as part of your work to bring social justice and equity to ocean governance. So this event is being recorded and it will be made available on the Ocean Nexus Center website soon. Please direct all of your questions to our presenters in the chat and help us maintain a safe and friendly space. So we are very excited to share with you some of the work that has been done since Ocean Nexus Center launched 2 years ago. To kick us off, we're starting our program with the director of the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center, Yoshitaka Oda. Yoshi, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Constance. Let me just share my screen. And hopefully it's working okay.
Looks great.
Okay, and I can't really see myself, but I assume it's going okay. Can you see me okay?
Looks good.
Right, okay, I'm just gonna start. Right, since we have so many presentations today, and then I'm just so excited. But first, let me thank everyone for joining us today. My name is Yoshitaka Ota. I am the director of the Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center. But you will quickly see from the many talented speakers we have here today, this work is a huge team effort spanning over 20 partner institutes and over 70 principal investigators and the fellows from around the world. So I'm just so excited to share with you. Before we hear from the researchers, however, I would like to take just a couple moments to introduce our vision and priorities with you all. Ocean Nexus Center, again, let me just change to the next slide. Okay, right. Ocean Nexus Center envisions a future where oceans benefit people equitably in a culturally relevant manner. There are millions of people, actually everyone around the world, who have no votes in how the oceans are being fished, used, or governed, even though they rely on oceans for their livelihoods and their lives and their identities. We believe that this is wrong. Today, scientists and policymakers from around the world are working to make important decisions about how we will govern our oceans in the face of climate change, pollution, and other important environmental and social issues. We believe that we need to develop a new, or let's say alternative way to operate ocean governance. So it includes the voices of ocean communities and prioritizes the diversity of current and future relationships that exist between people and the oceans. The Ocean Nexus Center aims to address this systemic issue through coordinating research, training, communicating, and collaborating so we can transform ocean governance. Our work is focused on 3 steps: recognize, recover, and reverse. First, we must recognize diverse knowledge and relationships and observe what is happening today and what we have done wrong, and then construct stories that address the current issues with evidence. Next, we must identify equitable solutions and the tools that are needed in order to recover from the harm and failure of historical and current tactics. This is very important. Finally, we must reverse inequality and injustice by transforming the system. This means supporting cutting-edge scholarship and resisting to engage with the all too common and popular narratives that do not promote social equity. These are the critical steps we must take to close the gap of inequality and ensure our oceans are for all people, not just privileged few. And I'm going to change the slide. Sorry. So we have done quite a few work already in the Ocean Nexus Center. So today's really is an event to celebrate for our publications and the speakers, but I also like to celebrate our next step. Today, you will hear from researchers who are on two sides of the same coin, I believe. The first group is based out of the Ocean Nexus Center, and then they will share their perspectives on social science for oceans, including topics such as coastal communities, culture, public health, blue economy, sustainable development, and hearing from voices that have been ignored. The second half of the program, you'll hear from researchers based at Nereus Network, which used to be a Nereus program, is renowned for their work in natural science stream, including topics such as climate change and habitat restorations. But I myself, so looking forward to catch up with my old friends and colleagues who's going to teach us about what's going on in the environment. So looking forward to it. And I have to say, this is a first step to connect social science and the natural science to change governance structures, hopefully, and really to consider what we can do for future generation as well as current generations, and thinking about people and the principle of no one should be left behind. So let's take a first step. Okay. Finally, none of this work would be possible without the partnership of two organizations, the Nippon Foundation and the University of Washington Earth Lab. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Ben Packard, the Harriet Bullitt endowed Executive Director of Earth Lab, a center that, like Ocean Nexus, center equity and social justice in the core of our work. So I'm going to pass it to you, Ben, but I might need some technical change first. Thank you. I'm going to stop share. And
hello, Dr. Ota and team with Ocean Nexus. It is a thrill to be here with you this afternoon and to take a few minutes to share a little bit about Earth Lab. I'm so excited to hear from you. I'm going to take 2 seconds to share just a little bit about Earth Lab. We are an institute here at the University of Washington that is pushing boundaries to develop innovative, just, and equitable solutions to environmental challenges. We are not a traditional academic unit, but we are supporting people in those units to connect across sectors and academic disciplines, to inspire and incentivize new partnerships that are bridging the University of Washington and all the great universities that you all work with and the wider community. On this bridge, not only is information flowing out, but we're also seeking the input of the community to guide our research on pressing problems. The Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Center is one of 8 Earth Lab member organizations that are working on a variety of complex environmental issues, such as the health benefits of time spent in nature, community resilience in the face of climate change, ocean acidification, and so much more. One of the common elements across all of these programs is our commitment to center equity and justice in our work. What does this mean? For us, this means we've got an innovation grants program that funds new research at the intersection of climate and social justice. It also means that we require that our teams include partners from the communities who help define the problem they're trying to solve. And we're pushing our academic institutions to find ways to compensate these community members for their time. We're also committed to listening to the communities that are disproportionately affected by the environmental and climate issues, and we're committed to showing up and learning from them. If this sounds different from a traditional academic unit, that's because it is. And this is the way we build lasting solutions for the people and the planet. And so for all of these reasons, we're thrilled to support Yoshi and the Ocean Nexus Center and all of you, and we're thankful to the Nippon Foundation for their partnership. Congratulations on the first 2 years. We're excited to see what comes next. Back to you, Dr. Ota.
I will from here. Thank you so much, Yoshi and Ben, for setting the stage. And next, I'd like to introduce you all to the Deputy Director of the Ocean Nexus Center, Andres Cisneros Montemayor. Andres, off to you.
Thanks, Constance. Hey, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. I'll try and share my screen here in a sec. What's that?
It sounds good.
Okay, perfect. Like everyone else, I'm really, really happy to see everyone here. And I mean, I would love to see you all in person, even just that little bit that we had before it started, and just seeing old friends and in the little Zoom box that we've been looking at for the last couple of years was great. I see a lot of participants too that I don't know. Welcome. We're super happy to have everyone here. And so I'll get us kicked off with the presentations. And I think you can see that, hopefully. Am I good, Constance? So
we do.
Yep, perfect. Thanks, Yoshi. So the title from this came out, no apologies for pushing equity, out of a lot of conversations that we've had where sort of over time, since I was a student, which is not that long ago, but longer than I would like to remember, we often, thought about equity a lot, or justice at a fundamental level, even if you weren't trained in it. I know that I wasn't. And I'm really happy that we've come to a place now, certainly with Nereus and Ocean Nexus, but I think more broadly, where we can really think hard about it and not really hold back from speaking about these issues that are so important to us in our own research, as well as in our personal lives. And so, as Yoshi mentioned, a lot of the things that we do, sort of a thing that I always come back to is that, we need really urgent solutions for these global challenges, whether we talk about climate change or economic shocks or many others that we could think of. But we also have to make sure that no one's left behind, even as we solve these things, right? Because solutions can have different consequences. And so in terms of a blue economy, which is a lot of the work that I do, and I think a lot of you in Nereus and Nexus will see your work reflected in this. I've really built it all together with you over these years. But we have to remember that when we think about a blue economy and this marine industrial revolution, these industrial revolutions aren't new. Like, we can look at the history of terrestrial changes and a lot of the history in the ocean. The ocean has changed a lot over the last centuries. So now when we think about all these sort of existing sectors like fisheries or aquaculture, or these emerging ones like blue carbon or bioprospecting, we have to really remember what it is that we're trying to achieve with this development. And so in our research and in our lived experiences, what we've seen is that the negative legacies of industrial development go really beyond emissions or extinctions or pollution, overfishing for a lot of us who are in that ocean space. And I think in the background, we are aware of all these other issues. And those are the ones that we're trying to bring to the forefront now. Things like colonialism, things like labor abuses or modern slavery, things like inherent inequities in human health brought about by our economic systems and our systems of consumption are things that, again, I think many of us have always been aware of in our own lives, but now we are able to bring that into our research, and Nexus and Nereus have given us a really great platform to do that. And so with that in mind, when we talk about a transformative blue economy, which is what I and many others are hoping that it is, considering those social components, that part of social equity in all of its forms, because that's a very broad concept, it is the key, right? And so with that all in mind, something that we were able to ask then is, so do we have the capacity then to establish a blue economy? And I think a lot of us have talked for a long time about resources, and we see it in a lot of the international development plans, or whether you go to national plans or intergovernmental ones. We're often thinking about, well, where are these fish? Where is this oil sometimes, that I don't think should be included. But where are these resources that we're going to exploit? And we're not really thinking about, how do we enable these things to develop equitably? How do we make sure that it's so sustainable? How do we make sure that it's economically viable? Because of course, that's something that's essential for a lot of these coastal nations and communities. And so out of all this work that we've done, and again, together, I say we because all of you, or many of you from Nereus and Nexus have contributed to this incredibly significantly. We can see that when we put all of our information together, all of our knowledge, we find that one, we can find resources anywhere, but we can't find all resources everywhere. And so sometimes we have to really temper our expectations a little bit when it comes to ocean development, and maybe try and think a bit more carefully about what we're going to try and develop and whether or not that makes sense, just purely ecologically for the places that we're talking about. The second part is that enabling conditions. So if we want to get more specific, things like equity and rights and even infrastructure and things more in sort of built capital are really, really different across regions and even within regions and within specific countries, right? There's enormous variation across the world. And that's what we see and what we talk about when we talk about inequities in any part of the world. And so our takeaways from a lot of these global analyses, and obviously this isn't the only one that tries to do this sort of thing for specific sectors or at the global level. If we want to achieve a blue economy, that's going to depend on establishing those enabling conditions, again, to make things equitable and sustainable and viable, not just on finding resources. And that really changes our perspective on what we need to address, right? Because even though a lot of us are in the international space and we're used to moving in that space, we have to cooperate to achieve success. A lot of us know that, and we do that into our work. And we have to embrace these new technologies and understand what they're doing and what they would allow us to do in the future. But we also have to be really honest about the potential of these things and their effects on the people that they're really impacting. Most of you know I'm from a small fishing town in Mexico, and I never forget, what is all, I get invited to these meetings, I publish these papers, I meet incredibly interesting people from across the world. But what does that mean for the people in my community? All this work that I'm doing, all the ink that's been published, am I having a true impact? Am I really thinking about what these agreements mean for them? And I think a lot of us are starting to do that more and more, and it's what we need to continue doing in the future. Because a lot of those frontline communities, they don't have a voice, and they often don't have the tools to engage in those types of debates or push for equity when they know that they need it. But we do. We do have those tools. We have that interest. And through a lot of the work that we've done in Nereus and Nexus that I'm incredibly proud and happy to be a part of, we've sort of really pushed the boundaries of what we can do with our modern knowledge and methodological techniques when you put that together with really committed people to making real change. And so I think for a lot of us, equity is really at the center of what we hope to achieve in our aspirations for future oceans and in our personal lives, beyond the oceans themselves. So we can't hesitate to push for it. And I think I get to come back to the beginning of the talk. I really feel like we're at a place where we don't have to hesitate to push for these things that we really hold dear and that our research supports. So thank you very much. Constance, I'll turn it over to you. I think you're managing these time things, and I really hope to see you all again in person very soon, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andres. Up next, we have Gerald Singh. He is the Ocean Nexus Center Research Chair, and his presentation is on, he is the Deputy Science Director, and his presentation is on, but what should we do? Establishing research programs for equity and sustainability. Gerald?
Thank you, Constance. Thought my position changed for a second. I'll just change my share my screen. I hope you can see this. I'm assuming you can. So as Constance said, I'm Deputy Science Director, Deputy Research Director for the Ocean Nexus Center, and I'm going to be talking about research plans and programs and try to be a bit provocative about it, really noting that the Nexus Center is really trying to focus on integrating knowledge, doing kind of very forward thinking, and really promoting diversity in thought and ways forward, noting that a lot of what we're trying to contribute to has never been done before, so we need new ideas for it. And so it's an interesting title, but what should we do? Establishing research programs for equity and sustainability. really the title comes from just these sometimes you can consider glib notions of just listening to the science. If only we listened to the science, we'd be in better situations. And you can see these kinds of calls all over the place, a lot in the popular media and the public, for different issues, for things that a lot of us would agree on, like climate change, and a lot of things also for issues that I'm sure even within the group we have here today, we wouldn't agree on, like GMOs. I mean, I bet if I polled people here, we would have different opinions on what the science actually says on GMOs. And we'd have quite very varied values associated with it. And this notion that science can't parse different values in that way is a really important one when thinking about how science can contribute to decision making. There's an entire field of studies that's kind of based on it and pointing out when science is taken too far, or when the wrong kinds of science are put in place to address political decisions. That's one side of things. Is there's the values component. The other side, just to kind of poke and prod at one of our fellow Nereus people, is that a lot of times science is really focused on documenting declines, and that's not in itself a bad thing. So here's in reference to a study that one of the Nereus fellows, Tyler Eddy, who I'm pretty sure is on this call, has led on coral declines. I mean, this kind of science has its place for sure. It's important, but I want to try to be a bit provocative to talk about compatible kinds of research programs, so that we're not just doing science that documents declines. So what does the science tell us? Oftentimes it's a lot less than we think, and a lot less than we want. So again, as I was saying, there's entire literature about kind of the use, abuse, and misuse of science and public policy. And one very kind of glaring example of this really points out to differences in attitudes and priorities between researchers and policymakers. In the establishment of the US Global Change Research Program, for example, the intended goal of the program was to conduct research that was going to contribute to actionable mitigative and adaptation strategies around climate change. That was the goal. Most of the researchers involved instead were really focused on making more accurate and more current climate change models, modeling the actual mechanisms and functions behind climate change. And in the end, the program, or this iteration of it, was quite limited in what it could say for adaptation and mitigation standards. It could really only tell us, what amount of CO2 we're able to release to prevent some level of impact. When policymakers really wanted to develop adaptation plans, for example. And so it shows this kind of disconnect between the research community and the policy community. And a lot of this, I think, can be tracked back to this idea of a linear model of science. And so this is a model of science and knowledge that philosophers of science will talk about as really coming to the fore from the European Enlightenment, and really being prevalent and developed in the US and the UK. And it essentially works like this, is that if we want to apply science and knowledge to practical problems, we should learn all the fundamental mechanics and mechanisms behind it, because if we know the building blocks, we can know the effects. In reality, this model really rarely works for solving problems, and for a number of reasons. And a lot of research actually shows that a lot of times fundamental insights come the exact opposite way, is in trying to apply and do practical problem solving, we find out fundamental aspects of nature. And so it leads me to pose a challenge more for kind of, I guess, the research policy side of research itself. in that we need to kind of rethink some of the standards in academic research. Academia is sometimes referred to as the last vestige of medieval European guilds. And the value system and philosophy behind knowledge and knowledge to action in some ways hasn't changed much from medieval and Enlightenment European times. And this has massive effects on just who takes part in science and who gets awarded for it. So here's just a plot looking at health researchers in the US, looking at proposals for the National Institutes of Health, and the kinds of proposals. So this is a word cloud. So it's grouping different kinds of proposals for different research based on if it comes from African American and Black researchers versus non-African American and Black. And you can see that they group very differently. Oftentimes the African American communities would focus on interventional research, so actually studying an intervention itself. A lot of times it was community focused, et cetera, versus the non-African American communities. It's essentially white communities would focus on these kind of mechanistic understandings to health. Maybe no surprise, the right side school of proposals would often get funded more often and for more money. But in effect, the same research finds that this research on the left is often more relevant for policy and even performs better on standard citation metrics. And so there's this kind of cultural, and it becomes somewhat racially biased attitude towards research itself and what it leads to and where it stems from. And so my challenge is we dropped this notion of academic excellence, and for a number of reasons. One of them is at the institutional level itself, we don't really know what it contributes to. So this is some research that I'm conducting right now, looking at the performance of so-called most prestigious universities in the world, ranked from 1 being best up to 200 being worst, against indices of how these same research institutes contribute to the different sustainable development goals. And what we see is essentially there's no relationship. It's not clear what our notions of academic excellence and prestige really contributes to. The only potential relationship that we find is on SDG 4, which is on education, and it's potentially a negative relationship. So the more prestigious university, the less it contributes to global education initiatives. A second challenge I would pose would be to researchers itself, and it would be to rethink notions put forward by prestigious and inward-looking academic institutions around how the environment, society, and economy relate to each other. So it's really common for us to propose essentially first principles-based models, such as saying, well, the economy is really just a subset of society, and it's all a subset of the environment. If we don't have the environment, we don't have anything else. That makes sense on a first principles basis, but it's problematic when we start thinking about what that means for policy planning, because some researchers will take that to mean in order to achieve development initiatives, that therefore we need to start with environmental initiatives and go forward. Everything stems from the environment. But if you look into the literature on this, you can find that these kinds of policies can backfire, and they often have very limited policy impact and uptake. In fact, for some other research I've started conducting, I've been able to actually track the ways that different sustainable development goals are related to each other in this kind of cause and effect manner. And from causation studies, there's this notion of Granger causality, where you can look to see what follows what. So if you do something, what happens? And you can track relationships between SDGs here. And so I have this simple framework where looking at SDG 14, which is the ocean goal. So if it has a co-benefit across other SDGs, and then looking at the reverse, how that some other SDG works on SDG 14, the ocean goals. So you can have these combinations of relationships, such as if different SDGs are trade-offs with each other, if they're co-benefits with each other, or if there's these kind of asymmetries. And focusing on these asymmetry areas can really give us a sense of the directionality and some of the causes, what contributes to what. And so if we have something falling in this bracket here, you should maybe start with the oceans, because if you start with this other SDG, you might not get far, versus the other way around up here. So you might want to start with the other SDG, because if you start with the oceans, you're going to have trade-offs. You're going to hinder your development planning. So what do we see? We see kind of a messy map, but in effect, what we're finding is, if we look down in this corner, contributing to ocean goals, this is data actually across 27 different countries around the world on their SDG linkages together. So it's partially there. I still have some countries to add to this. But if you address ocean goals, it'll contribute to food, water, and land goals. But if we look up here, what's maybe the best way to start to address ocean goals? They're essentially socioeconomic. Reducing inequalities in economy, health, energy, institutions, communities, international partnerships. And so maybe we need to rethink these first principle models and really think about best ways to address ocean sustainability that goes against kind of the norm. And so instead of really just thinking about this linear model way of doing science, we have to think about who are we serving? And if we're not just wondering about, how to get ahead within our own fields, we need to really think about how to conduct research that contributes towards sustainable development, and that's often going to mean co-design partnership with end users of research, and have them design not just or be a really important part of the priorities for the research, as well as helping measure things and assess and evaluate. That's going to be a really important aspect to this. And just to close, we really want to address a solutions-based orientation in research, and that probably means a combination of these things. It's going to be designed with communities and end users of research, more intervention-based and less reliance on kind of first principles, more based on evaluation, because there's a lot of ongoing initiatives that we can essentially treat as natural experiments. We can use it to test theories of change that often are just assumed. And we really need to do multi-criteria evaluation, because real-world decisions are often very complex and can't be reduced to single dimensions. And I know I'm a bit over time, so I'm just going to leave it there.
All right, thank you, Gerald. Quentin, you are up next, everybody. Up next, we have Quentin Hannitch. He is the Ocean Nexus Center Research Chair, and his presentation is on equity in the Indo-Pacific tuna fisheries.
Thank you very much. Hopefully now you're seeing my screen. Anyway, look, I'd like to thank very much the Nippon Foundation and Earth Lab Center. This is one of my favorite programs. It's a really interesting, exciting group of people, and I really cherish this opportunity. So I'm going to talk about equity in the Indo-Pacific tuna fisheries, which is the research program that we lead. And I also just wanted to note that this is really a team effort. I'm just presenting this on behalf of a group of people, from PhD students to fellows and principal investigators. So really this is not just me. But anyway, let's move on. So when we talk about fisheries management or marine conservation or ocean governance, we're not managing the fish, we're not managing coral reefs, we're managing people. And it's a simple, easy, trite point, but it's important to remember. So we are managing the activities of ourselves, and we are then trying to obviously come up and achieve goals that we have in our management arrangements. And of course, that includes equity, how we actually decide to manage ourselves. The area that I work in is obviously international, and in that international space, I've always loved Ambassador Pardo's quote, "We live in a system of sovereign states, jealous of their powers." This is quite basic, even though the system itself is obsolescent. We basically live in a kindergarten. Sometimes we overestimate the influence and impact of international law. So it's important to remember that's the system that we actually try to manage these transboundary fisheries within. So the Indo-Pacific tuna fisheries include the world's biggest tuna fisheries. They're critically important. They raise fundamental equity questions that have global significance. But when we talk about the exploitation and management, this occurs within a post-colonial geopolitical, economic and trade context that favors the existing industries, the powerful distant water fishing fleets, and the markets that promote these interests. And this is actually going to go to some of the stuff that Gerald was just talking about with SDGs, about not getting caught up just out at sea, but also recognizing and understanding the bigger picture and those other factors that strongly influence how we actually manage our oceans. So this morning, I'm just going to quickly talk about part of our program. I'll give a brief introduction to the context, the ocean governance and small island developing states. That's the focus for our program. I won't go into too much detail, but I'll just quickly give an example of the Pacific. We're still really getting our head around the Indian Ocean side. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. And then just briefly talk about our research program. Going back to Gerald's point on the SDGs, we're obviously looking at SDG 14 as sort of the framing or entry point. But what we're really actually focusing much of our work on is on the point 7, increasing the benefits to small island developing states. So when we talk about this, we need to remember the kind of the big picture context, the legal framework. And the 1982 Law of the Sea provides the Constitution for the Oceans. It's actually quite a remarkable document, and I think it's actually something of a success in terms of the achievement of an international negotiation of a very large document that governs much of our Earth. It took about 3 different attempts and 30 years to negotiate it, and was eventually agreed in 1982. At its adoption, it was suggested that the property rights granted to coastal states would significantly resolve many of our problems for sustainable management. But I also note that neither the US nor 1 or 2 other countries actually agreed to the Law of the Sea. So it's a good example where it has become, in effect, customary practice, and it's widely adopted and implemented, despite the fact that the US has never actually joined it. Now, why is it important? Well, for small island developing states, it really did change how we view them. So this is a map of the world's largest ocean, covering almost half of our planet. And in the typical pre-Law of the Sea, mid-Atlantic viewpoint, you would see a lot of blue. The countries that we are talking about, some of them are so small terrestrially that they simply do not show up on the map. So for example, when we talk about the country of Kiribati, a country that I used to work in a lot, and actually really miss and love. We're talking about a country that is so small terrestrially that you can't see it on this map. It's basically 33 tiny atolls with just over 800 square kilometers of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. But under the Law of the Sea, that country changes to becoming the 12th largest country in the world, and it has an exclusive economic zone of 3.5 million square kilometers. It's become a large ocean state with tremendous resources, and in a good year can actually catch about 12% of all of the world's tuna. So it's a very important country. Now, when we talk about the Pacific Island tuna fisheries, following the Law of the Sea and its establishment of these exclusive economic zones, we now see that about 87% of the catch is all taken from waters under national jurisdiction. Almost 60% of the catch is taken from the Pacific Island, small island developing states. So this was a big deal, and it's fundamental to small island developing states and their development aspirations and opportunities. However, by the early 1990s, it became apparent that the Law of the Sea wasn't sufficient to address our concerns, overfishing, overcapacity, and destructive fishing practices. And that really played out, particularly in the North Atlantic with the Canadian cod fisheries, and as well as various other places. So in 1992, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development catalyzed a special conference that subsequently led to the establishment of the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement. This was a massive step forward in many respects, importantly strengthened the duty to cooperate and implemented that through regional organizations, adopted a whole bunch of provisions and principles that I won't go into detail here that were also very important. But in this context, it also included provisions that recognize the special rights and aspirations of developing states. It provides quite a fair bit of detail on that, again, that I won't go into detail here. But one of the important parts that it did do was talk about this concept of disproportionate burden. So it recognized the vulnerability of developing states that are dependent on exploitation of living marine resources. It talked about the needs of subsistence, small scale and artisanal fish workers and other people. But it also talked about the need to ensure that regional fisheries management organizations ensure that conservation and management measures do not result in transferring, directly or indirectly, a disproportionate burden of conservation action onto developing states. I'm highlighting the developing states because in the last 10 years, I have heard developed states talk about this quite a lot and try to appropriate this language to actually include them. But it is very clear that the legal framework, we're really talking about recognizing these development aspirations and the need to ensure that we don't apply a disproportionate burden onto developing states. It shares some similarities with the differentiated responsibilities in climate change, for example. So for this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the Pacific, but our work is also stretching across the Indo-Pacific. And we've done that strategically because many of these issues are connected. Many of these issues are just as significant and important in the Indian Ocean. And the precedents that are established in one ocean seriously impacts on the other ocean as well. It's increasingly difficult to separate the Indian and Pacific Ocean fisheries because many of the distant water fishing states are members of both, and some delegations, particularly the EU, applies a very global view while it tries to enforce its will on many of these RFMOs. So we basically have to be aware and involved in the Indo-Pacific more broadly. But anyway, just for time, I'm going to talk about Pacific. So in the Pacific Islands, the Pacific Island states have established some of the world's most sophisticated and advanced regional cooperative tools. Some of you may have heard of the Forum Fisheries Agency or the Pacific Community, the parties to the Nauru Agreement. These are all really world's best practice, global precedent organizations that have done a lot of good at providing coordination, technical advice and support, and significantly improving benefits for the Pacific Island states. Effectively, they have developed collective bargaining at the international level and then enabled that collective bargaining to give them much, much greater benefits, engagement and control than they would otherwise have individually. They were also instrumental in negotiating and adopting the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission, which is the regional fisheries management organization. And that applies to the EEZs, the high seas, the distant water fishing fleets. It has very strong FFA engagement, and it also includes all of the distant water fishing nations. So although the WCPFC does actually describe some criteria for allocation, it doesn't include any weighting or prioritization, and it's also not exclusive. So this question of allocation becomes really important in the WCPFC context. We did actually have some early initiative, and I guess going back a bit, I've been going to this thing and involved in this thing for almost 20 years now, since about 2003. So our team, many members of our team actually have a lot of history in the WCPFC and also in the Pacific Island fisheries. So we sometimes talk about these things as personal memories. But anyway, we did actually have some attempts in the early days and around about 2005, 2006 to start initiating some discussions on how we would implement allocation and allocate the rights for these fisheries in the Pacific. But even at that time, we could not find any agreement on just how we would actually implement the law of the sea and the coastal state sovereign rights and recognize those concerns. So in those early days, we had arguments about whether allocations should recognize the coastal state limits or whether they should just basically dictate to the coastal states what their limits should be. So we didn't make any progress. And in that gap, the decisions on conservation effectively indirectly allocated the opportunities and limitations, because each potential management option and each management option that we chose supports conservation and management objectives to varying degrees, but it also impacts on the interests of WCPFC members also to varying degrees and potentially applies a disproportionate burden onto developing states. So in that context, some of our conservation measures currently require broad exemptions for developing states so as to avoid a disproportionate burden. But we all understand that these exemptions effectively weaken the measure. They open loopholes, they make it very difficult for scientists to actually understand the impact of the measure, they make monitoring, control and surveillance difficult, they're not ideal. But in order to remove those exemptions, we need to make progress on this equity question. We need to actually develop our understanding and adopt equitable limits and allocations that ensure sustainable and transparent long-term management. This question of transparency also becomes crucial too, because in order to understand these impacts, we actually have to have information and data to understand what potential measure or scientific advice will impact on what particular interest. We also obviously need to understand the negotiations and have a thorough understanding of transparency so that we support and enable developing state participation without undermining their own power. So right at the moment, we have both the WCPFC and also the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission in the midst of difficult negotiations as they argue over fishing limits and enduring allocations while delegations provide differing legal interpretations. We also see, and this is not new, delegations led by fisheries ministries that do not necessarily reflect whole of government policies. We often hear about industry capture of ministries that are supposed to regulate the industry, but often end up coming to represent the industry. We certainly see that in Australia, in my own experience with our mining industry. So these fisheries ministries and fisheries delegations can end up focusing on short-term vested industry interests over the long-term national interests. And this can lead to incoherent priorities and decisions that don't necessarily reflect their actual whole of government priorities. This is particularly problematic for developed state delegations that adopt positions that contradict geopolitical interests and aid commitments. Developing state delegations, particularly in the Pacific, are obviously very small with small administrations, but tend to actually represent and have a better idea of their whole of government view than the large developed state delegations that seem to get captured by their industry. So when we're talking about all of this, we have to actually understand a number of factors. And I won't go through this in detail at the moment because we'll take forever. But zone-based management is a critical goal for particularly the Pacific Island states and also of strong interest in many of the Indian Ocean coastal states. Zone-based management just basically means the law of the sea. It means recognizing and implementing sovereign rights as established by the law of the sea. However, many of the distant water fishing nations will try to apply a flag state approach that empowers their control and their fleets. Everyone recognizes that flag state jurisdiction is appropriate for the high seas, but we'll also see distant water fishing states try to apply a flag state jurisdiction across the entire range of the stock, including inside other people's EEZs, and this impacts on sovereign rights. We see this very strongly in the Indian Ocean at the moment, where the EU is proposing a model of catch attribution that basically provides the catch history to the flag state for fish that it caught inside someone else's exclusive economic zone. And we see ongoing arguments with the EU about that. Other factors to be included are the obvious development aspirations in the context of the SDGs and everything else, and then having a thorough understanding of all the different fishing impacts, the gear, the species, the vessels, processing ports, and a whole bunch of other important factors. One of the other things, particularly in the Indo-Pacific in the current context, is also understanding the geostrategic and ODA interests as well. In the Pacific, this is one of the most critical forms of revenue. So we've been doing quite a lot of work lately, also understanding how climate change impacts on that likely revenue going into the future. But basically in the Pacific, some countries depend on revenue from these purse seine tuna fisheries for large proportions of their government. I'm not going to go into detail at the moment, but we've also been doing work on understanding the different interests so we can understand how different measures will impact on those interests. And I've got a couple of charts here that Kamal Azmi has produced as part of some recent work that we've also been doing on that. This one basically just identifies the different interests between coastal states and flag states, and that provides an important understanding of how different measures will actually impact and potentially apply a disproportionate burden. This all happens within the context also of livelihoods and food security. Climate change and overpopulation pressures are having significant impacts on food security for many of the Pacific Island coastal states. So we're also seeing an increasing need to better think about how we can utilize nearshore and oceanic tuna fisheries for coastal communities as well. And again, climate change is obviously a massive impact in a range of different contexts. Some recent work led by Johan Bell that we're all involved with as an Ocean Nexus activity identified the potential significant losses to government revenue in the region as climate change pushed our tuna fisheries more into the Central Pacific, which is more comprised of high seas. So, in order to wrap up, in order to support equitable outcomes for small island developing states and enable transformative change, and pretty well that's what our goal is, we need to actually understand what that means in practice and the key factors that influence and enable equitable benefit sharing. In effect, we need to step back and understand the problem and not just get caught up in the regional fisheries management organizations, but understand the underlying factors, the overarching global institutions, the reality of both historical colonialism and arguably neo-colonialism that is occurring now. We need to understand how these policies and frameworks institutions support and undermine equitable development and ocean governance. So the work that we've been doing at a recent research workshop that our centre hosted has really been looking at what does an equitable transboundary fishery look like and the different aspects of that, the legal and policy frameworks, the decent work for fishers, the equitable allocations, the future responses and current responses to climate change, how negotiations actually occur, what does a value chain look like in an equitable fishery, and also understanding the obstacles and the assumptions and the values. And I think Gerald also made some important points about this as well. I have a particular bugbear about assumptions because our assumptions are generated from our own personal context, and often our assumptions don't necessarily reflect reality or perhaps reflect ourselves better than the subject that we're trying to study. So we're also coming up with our research strategy, which basically goes through two themes. In this context of negotiations and advocacy and international cooperation and collectivism, capacity and advocacy are really important. So we are developing skill sharing, workshops and materials to support and enable small island developing states to negotiate and advocate collectively and effectively. Now, the Pacific Island states have already done a lot of that. So we work closely already with the FFA in that context to provide support and materials for them. And we're now working with the Indian Ocean group of coastal states to now set up courses also for them. And we'll continue to try to do peer-to-peer skill sharing and workshops. We hope that the outcome from this will be increased expertise and knowledge and capacity and increased collective cooperation at community, government and sub-regional scales. And then that will obviously have an impact and enable small island developing states to effectively advocate and achieve their interests in international negotiations. That's not our interests, but that's what they determine to be their interests. Simultaneously, we've also got a development of research and development that will analyze the interests, obstacles, opportunities, pathways, and tools to achieve the equitable benefit sharing with the intent of exposing and removing those obstacles and supporting implementation of these pathways and tools that will then take us towards equitable benefit sharing and management of these Indo-Pacific tuna fisheries. Now, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to stop there and thank you very much. And I look forward to answering any questions. Big thank you to Nippon Foundation and Earth Lab as well.
Thank you, Quentin. And we do have, I am getting a message from Central Command here that Director Yoshi would like to pop back in and say a few words before we move on to our next presentation. Yoshi?
Hi, it really wasn't a command.
Just kidding. Central Command.
By the way, everyone, so good to see you. I just see in attendance, you guys all names from, my good old friends, and quite reminiscent from, Southeast Asia and Europe and, America, and you guys know who I'm talking about. I also like to introduce, dare to say, a wonderful friend of ours, Vicky Maki Honda, who's a program officer at the Nippon Foundation. We actually asked Chairman to speak, but this time he was a bit busy, which is understandable, and seeking for the next time. But I just wanted to say thank you, Vicky, and thank you for Nippon Foundation, and perhaps Vicky could say hello to us. Yeah.
Hello, good morning from Tokyo. I wasn't expecting to get this chance to greet everyone live, so it's very exciting. I'm really happy to see many of you who I was able to meet back in Princeton. And Mr. Sasakawa is very, very disappointed that he was not able to attend, but he's really looking forward to that next opportunity where he may be able to really come and see you and shake all of your hands and really get into that kind of dialogue. So we, as well, me, myself as well, we are all looking forward to that next opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky, and thanks. Great to hear from Tokyo. Everybody, a little bit breeze, it's a lot of talk, lots of things, but it's so good to see you all. And now I'm back into my central command, Constance.
Thanks, Yoshi. All right, up next, we have Elaine Fausman. She is our second Ocean Nexus Center Research Chair, and she is going to present public health considerations for oceans. So Elaine, I will find you. There we go. Are you able to start your video, Elaine? There we go, thank you. And you are muted.
I'm sorry, my connection might be a little bit tough, so I might end up having to stop sharing. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, well, if I have that problem, you'll have to let me know because I might not know it immediately. Okay, all right.
Sounds
So
good.
special thanks to the Nippon Foundation and to Professor Oda for giving me this opportunity to talk about public health considerations for oceans. My name is Elaine Fausman, and I'm at the University of Washington in the School of Public Health, where I direct an institute. Not here alone, and so some of my colleagues that are very active in the Nexus Hub at the University of Washington include Jill Fallman and Susie Ann, as well as then Ocean Nexus collaborators around the world. And I'm not going to call everyone out, but as you can see, they're a great group, even by their pictures, some looking skeptical and some looking really smiling. We have lots of hope here. So it's been a pleasure and an honor to work with them to deal with issues of public health. So what is it that we mean when we really talk about public health? Well, it's the science of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health and well-being. So this is exactly the types of things that we want to be involved in and understand as a part of our center. We don't want to be treating diseases, we want to be preventing it. We don't want to be treating impacts from environmental issues. We want to prevent those environmental issues. So it's not just the absence of disease. This type of construct is extremely important. And as you may have heard, there are concepts out there talking about oceans health, human health and oceans. So what kinds of things do we need to consider? Well, in these kinds of approaches, people are looking at understanding the underlying mechanisms of marine processes and public health, and understanding both the benefits and challenges in looking at issues that connect and interrelate human health and oceans. So on this inadequate picture, you can see that we have ecosystem services, we have marine biodiversity, we have seafood and health benefits, but we also have contamination. We have pollution, water, soil, air, chemical and physical. We have biological hazards. Not only are algae important, but they also produce harmful algal blooms, which are effective in impacting many of our systems, both human and ecological. We also have climate change. So the idea of how to define well-being and cultural context needs us to look broadly, and the oceans and human health construct helps us to start to do that. Now, we're not the only one looking at human health as a critical factor in how we examine oceans. And as we heard earlier, on the right side of this slide, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, as adequate or inadequate as they may be. We also have programs that are called One Health, where various centers are looking at individual and community well-being within the construct of animal health and environmental health. And on the left side, we have a contrast with medical sciences, which is usually based on systems within the human body, but we have concepts of planetary health, which broadens health research to include external systems. And this idea of looking at interrelatedness of systems and really understanding what well-being means in the concept of oceans and human health is critical, we posit, and is one of the areas that we're looking at within the center. One of the other constructs that I like to use because of my activities in looking at risk analysis and risk communication is to use a risk assessment framework where we look at exposures, toxicity, and risk characterization. But this in itself is not sufficient for us to understand the myriad of impacts that we have to look at, as well as the benefits in determining what a particular concept for well-being would mean for oceans and human health. We do focus on looking at risk factors, and these are variables that can contribute to the likelihood or impact of a public health concern. And these can include many of the factors that you're already talking about in this panel discussion this afternoon. And these include economics, gender issues, environmental and ecological, infrastructure and policies, programmatic, social, cultural, and epidemiology. But at this interface, we need systems to be able to allow us to pull all these risk factors together and understand in our definitions. So we consider risk factors as targets for risk reduction interventions to be able to mitigate, to intervene, and to identify co-solutions. So risk factors could help: where is exposure occurring? Who is exposed? And be able to illustrate some of the injustices in the idea of who's accepting the risks and who's obtaining the benefits. When do exposures occur? How does it impact individual communities, and in particular, our coastal communities? And what stakeholders can contribute to the reduction of these factors? When we do risk assessment, we use frameworks for risk characterization, but oftentimes these have lacked cultural and life stage population considerations. What does this mean for children and our next generations in the decisions that we make in the context of public health? So to ensure this, we need to consider much larger issues of well-being and not just the absence of disease. And what better place to do this than in oceans and human health? One of the things that we're seeing is that in some of the cases, and one of the cases we're going to talk about just briefly with 2 slides, are some of the marine plastics, which was used as a case study in some of the work that we've been doing, is the idea of the promise and hope of life cycle assessment. But one of the things that we see right away with these life cycle assessments is that they're not broad enough in terms of the characterization of factors. And so even at the very early points, what they call midpoint analyses, the methods and the observations that we look at are inadequate to look at issues of well-being in the context that we wish. This is impacted in the case study that I mentioned with microplastics, marine litter, and now more frequently nanoplastics, and the considerations for how humans are exposed and impacted. So our solutions and approaches for this need to be beyond just life cycle analysis. So how do we get at some of these broader concepts? Well, we were fortunate enough to have the support of the Nippon Foundation and to be able to set up a series of well-being workshops. And these had the goal to encompass and understand a holistic approach to well-being for oceans. And on my third slide that I showed today shows some of the partners that were involved in this. But what this did was to allow us to start to look at the different dimensions of well-being, integrating economic, social, political, cultural, health-based, and ecosystem-related well-beings within integrated systems on this. The report from this workshop is still to be developed, but one of our critical products is the idea of the video and the workshop itself and the outputs that are coming from that, including new insight in this idea and identification of tools for useful for well-being. So one of the things that we've been doing in particular for tools is to look at well-being surveys and what kinds of questions do you need to ask to be able to better understand this complexity? This is an example of some of the surveys from Elmira and Accra in Ghana. And this is one case where the goal was to understand how marine litter affects individual, family, and community well-being in coastal communities. This used a variety of the modules that we identified and developed as a part of our well-being discussions and research. And I think that, well, I know a little bit, although it's not all decoded yet, but the idea that results from this will be actually really informative in determining, did we get the right people at the table? Did we get the right questions to be asked? And this has provided a mixed methods approach to be able to look at this. So what are some of our next steps? Well, we'll be doing the data analysis for the Ghana surveys. We're going to be doing the Ocean Nexus Wellbeing Workshop report and identifying the next steps that are needed to make these well-being contexts come alive. We're also finishing our chapter on the marine litter and well-being, and we'll also be discussing these issues of marine litter and equity considerations. All of this has been made possible from a series of collaborations from those that were present at the Wellbeing Workshop, but also collaborators around the world to move forward what we want to do to incorporate public health in well-being discussions and to be able to ensure improved approaches that include island community voices, concerns, and impacts within systems-based thinking. So I'm going to actually stop there because I know we're a little bit behind on time and hopefully open up for the next set of discussions that will come forth from these presentations. And again, special thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That was wonderful. Up next, we have our final presentation from the Ocean Nexus Center crew. We have research fellow Harriet Hardin Davies, and I'm pleased to share that starting in November, Harriet will join the Nexus program office as a deputy research director. And here today, she's going to speak to us about the ocean decade and global ocean governance. Go ahead, Harriet.
Thank you so much, Constance, and hello, colleagues. I'm just hoping to share some slides here. So can you see slides? And do you have presenter view or slideshow view?
You'll need to swap your display.
Let me just do my display swap. Here we go. Okay, splendid. I think we're on. Well, hello, everyone. And what a very warm thank you for not only inviting me to speak with you tonight, but giving me yet another very warm welcome into the Nexus family. It really is an honor. I wanted just to quickly sort of share a bit of a personal anecdote about why I'm really, really thrilled to be part of this program. I spent many years in my early career talking about interdisciplinary approaches and international collaboration and innovation, working as a person working in science and technology policy and in my early sort of PhD research on the law of the sea. But I really can't emphasize enough how the experiences and sort of training that I've been had the opportunity to be part of through Nexus have really opened my eyes to what it really means to work in an interdisciplinary space. I often have to have Google on hand to look up phrases. To be honest, the first time I ever heard the word deontological was last year. And I know that all my anthropology colleagues are falling off their chairs when I admit this, but I think that's the kind of safe space we have in Nexus where we can really come together. So I have the great pleasure today to speak about how the Nexus program is advancing equity through the UN Ocean Decade, introducing you to the Ocean Voices Decade Action, telling you a little bit about what's happened so far, and giving some ideas around where we're going to go next. So the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, called the Ocean Decade for short, kicked off this year. The decade is an initiative set forth by the international community that seeks to enable the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and, crucially, to leave no one behind, as my colleagues mentioned earlier, through accelerating ocean science and hoping to help eradicate inequality through enhanced accessibility to ocean science. The decade is shaped around 7 outcomes, and equity is very much central to the decade. We see this in the decade objectives around capacity building, around the recognition of the importance of the ocean for human health and well-being, and the very heavy access on increased access to opportunity through the decade. And this is very significant because the UN Ocean Decade is going to have implications for national ocean policies, national science policies and funding, and also regional and global ocean governance through legal instruments, policies, and other institutes and programs. But how exactly does ocean science contribute to sustainable development? And this is a question that many of us have been pondering recently. And how can it do so in a way that really does leave no one behind? More data might lead to decisions that lead to a better, fairer, equitable, more sustainable ocean. But science can also be used, misused, or ignored in ways that perpetuate inequities and unsustainable uses of the ocean. It's ultimately people, power, and politics that will determine the outcome of this decade. We explored some of these questions in a publication released last year, and really highlighted that the outcome of this decade will depend on how, where, when, and by whom ocean science is designed, funded, conducted, and used. So these questions around power, politics, people, the voice and agency and capacity of ocean-dependent coastal people that really emerged very strongly through the Nereus and Nexus contributions to the decade preparatory phase throughout 2019 and 2020. Through participation of our colleagues in the global planning meeting, in different regional and thematic planning meetings, it was really that very important central point around centralizing equity considerations in the decade that was at the heart of the comments that were submitted to the draft decade implementation plan last year, and emerged very strongly through the workshops that we held at the end of last year in asking ourselves the question, how can Ocean Nexus help to advance equity through the decade? All of that culminated in the proposal for an Ocean Voices Decade Action in January 2021. And we were absolutely thrilled in June when the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO announced the first series of endorsed decade actions, and the Ocean Voices Decade Action was amongst them. In the next couple of slides, I'd like to talk a little bit about what this action is all about, what we've done so far, and what we're likely to be doing next, and crucially, how all of you can be involved. So the Ocean Voices Decade Action is really based on this very strong acknowledgement that ocean science through the decade must meet the needs of ocean-dependent people and ensuring policies that achieve sustainable development goals in a way that really does leave no one behind. To do this, we're really seeing 3 key activities that we can promote through the decade. The first is, of course, advancing knowledge through the research that my colleagues have been talking about so far today. And we'll talk a little bit about that more shortly. The second is providing interdisciplinary tools and frameworks that can be used across all decade activities in order to really think about how to operationalize what the decade calls its underlying principles of fairness, equity, inclusion, and respect. And thirdly, and really importantly, is providing spaces that facilitate conversations and connections that make space to really listen and leave room for silence, to really, really listen to the voices that aren't currently being heard, and to think about ways that we, working with our partners, might be able to amplify those voices and make sure those needs can be met. Since the announcement of the decade endorsement in June this year, the Nexus program has been participating actively in partnering and discussing with the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission and other decade partners to think about really how we can all work together to make an impact through the decade. This has been done through talks on different panels. Matthew Colletier spoke at the IUCN panel just a couple of weeks ago, and Gerald Singh spoke at one of the decade laboratories earlier this year. But I'd like now just to spend a moment just reflecting on our first really sort of major event that we held. This was as part of the Predicted Ocean satellite event. This is a series of events that's being co-hosted by the German government and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission that's taking the place of the in-person launch event for the decade that was intended to be earlier this year. So this event was entirely focused on the predicted ocean outcome of the decade. And our panel event really focused on predicting sudden shocks to ocean ecosystems and coastal communities and exploring some of the implications for equity and justice. In the panel presentations from many colleagues and friends, I'm sure to all of you here, our panelists explored three key areas. Firstly, we highlighted the variety of different sudden shocks which can occur, from heat waves to a pandemic such as COVID, to challenges of sea ice stopping a very important supply vessel for a coastal community. Secondly, the panelists reflected on some of the challenges for governance that these types of sudden shocks present, and what can be predicted, but also what can't be predicted, and how equity considerations can be front and center of the future discussions going into the decade. But really importantly, this event was just the start of a conversation that will be continuing in the coming months, both to include more voices and more perspectives, but also to really think about how we can make an impact, not just in the decade itself, but with all the various different policy forums that will be relevant to this very wide-ranging issue. So that's just one example of what's happened so far, but what are we going to do next? So the next couple of months are going to be a really important time for scoping the future activities. One of the next events we have coming up will be between the 17th and 19th of November. The date will be confirmed shortly. This will be a Clean Ocean Laboratory satellite event. Many thanks to Dr. Jess Vandenberg and Holly Amos for really co-partnering in this and very much leading the charge here. And that event will be exploring a number of the equity considerations around marine litter and starting the process of developing a roadmap to really tackle that through the decade. In addition, we're going to be scoping new research projects. A couple of thoughts so far that we're looking into is how can data lead to better decisions through the decade? How can the collaborative design really include different voices in a meaningful way? We'll also, in that regard, be looking at workshops that we can help to pursue some of these different issues. We'll be thinking around ways of engaging in the Early Career Ocean Professional initiative. And many thanks here to our Early Career Ocean Professional focal points, Frédéric Fardin and Marlene Schutter. And in addition, we'll be looking at how we can contribute to the future satellite events taking place next year. I'm right on time, so it's time for me to wrap up. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to present the Ocean Voices Decade Action to you all. It's really crucial to highlight here that the Ocean Voices Decade Action is an opportunity for Nexus, the Nereus network, and our partners, collaborators, and friends to both interface with the UN Ocean Decade help to think about how this is an opportunity to influence some of the narratives that Professor Ota mentioned in the opening presentation. What narratives are serving marginalized groups? What narratives need to be confronted? And what voices need to be heard? Please do reach out with your ideas as we're going through the scoping process for this, and I very much look forward to our conversations. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Harriet. Now we are transitioning to our 5-minute lightning round presentations from our partners at the Nereus Program. And up first, we have Rachel Siri, who is presenting Developing Social and Ecological Indicators for the California Current Ecosystem. Rachel.
Okay.
You
can hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Siri. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Santa Cruz, participating in the Institute of Marine Sciences Fisheries Collaborative Program at NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center. And my work revolves around supporting ecosystem-based management in the California current ecosystem. And ecosystem-based management is an integrated management approach that recognizes all of the interactions within an ecosystem, including humans, rather than considering a single species, single issue, or ecosystem service in isolation. And to do this, we require ecosystem indicators. And these are indices that describe the status and trends of key ecosystem components. For those of you outside of the US, the California current ecosystem covers the west coast of the United States, from just below Vancouver Island to Baja California. And I'm going to share with you one example of the development of an ecosystem indicator, which really demonstrates how dynamic this region is and why ecosystem-based management is necessary. So this is a socioeconomic indicator, and it concerns the California Dungeness crab fishery. And this is a highly valuable fishery on the US West Coast. So in 2015, they experienced a large marine heat wave, which changed ocean conditions. Those ocean conditions caused a shift in the distribution of key prey species whales, such as krill and anchovy. In response, whale populations, which were steadily increasing, shifted their distribution in response to their prey. At the same time, a harmful algal bloom forced the Dungeness crab fishery to open later in the season than usual. And as a result, there was an increase in the overlap between whale populations and crab fishing gear, causing a 400% increase in whale entanglements. And this problem still exists. And in response, the fishery is now managed under a suite of ecosystem indicators, which determine entanglement risk. The problem with this process is that it means the crab fisheries close frequently when entanglement risk is high. This graph shows revenues over the last 2 fishing seasons. So the red line is 2019, the blue line is 2020, and the black shows a historic average from 2011 onwards. And you can see that closing the fishery potentially having impacts on revenues within the fishery due to the shortening of the season. So my research is developing retrospective estimates of revenues during these closure periods based on pre-season abundance estimates, as well as historic catches at the vessel level, in order to estimate fishery and vessel level losses due to these closure periods, with the ultimate goal of developing a socioeconomic indicator, which can be considered alongside existing ecological indicators. This is just one indicator that we're developing that I have time for today, but with this fantastic group of collaborators listed on the screen, we're developing more social and ecological indicators. So do stay tuned, keep in contact, and thanks very much for having me. It's been really nice to see you all again.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Up next, we have our presentation from Thomas Frolicker on ocean extreme events rarely occur in isolation. And you are joining us from very late time of day. So thank you so much, Thomas.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Can you actually hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm Thomas Frolicker. I was a Nereus fellow already a couple of years ago, and I'm currently assistant professor at the University of Bern and the head of the ocean modeling group. So I'm going to talk in these 5 minutes about ocean extremes, such as marine heat waves, and I will show actually that they rarely occur in isolation, that usually you have multiple extremes co-occurring at the same time and space, and that actually increases the risks of impacts. So you may have seen this figure before. This is actually a compilation of the most impactful marine heat waves which have been observed over the last 20 years. All over the ocean. So here is the big blob, which has been mentioned by Rachel before, which actually happened in 2013 and 2015, which had large impacts on all sorts of organisms and ecosystem services. So it had negative impacts on copepods and krills, on crab and mussels, salmon, groundfish, but also on higher trophic organisms such as baleen whales. And it also led to massive die-offs of seabirds, seals, and sea lions. But of course, there are always, when you have losers, there are always winners in the game. So actually, some species actually have benefited from the high temperatures, such as tuna, orcas, or rockfish. But predominantly, the impacts were negative of these heat waves. And if we look how these heat waves actually change since the beginning of the satellite period, you see in different bars the individual heat waves occurring around the globe in the global ocean. You clearly see that they were relatively rare at the beginning of the satellite record, but they become more and more frequent towards today. And also they become longer and longer. So here is the duration of these heat waves, and you can see that the blob actually was the longest and also the most intense heat wave since the start of the satellite record. And what we actually have shown in a paper last year, that actually the blob, for example, would have never occurred without global warming. So you may have heard about the heat waves in Canada and also the heat wave in Greece, where people have attributed the factor of human-caused global warming to the occurrence frequency of these heat waves. And actually, we have done similar things for the marine heat waves. And we actually we showed that actually the blob would have never been occurred without actually the increase in sea surface temperatures. And what we also showed is actually when you look at the return periods of this most impactful heat waves I've shown before. So here's the Northeast Pacific heat wave, that's the blob. So for 0-degree global warming at pre-industrial, actually that occurred every 1,000 years, such a blob event. And under 1.5 degrees global warming, such an event will actually occur every 3 to 5 years. And under 3 degrees global warming, it will actually occur every year. So we concluded that actually ambitious climate targets are indispensable to reduce the risk of marine heat waves impacts. So most of the research has so far focused on these heat waves. So you have CO2 emissions, atmospheric CO2, which is rising, that changes the weather and climate and also changes then ocean temperature, which leads to an increase in heat wave frequency. But at the same time, we have other stressors, like we have increase in CO2 in the atmosphere leads to ocean acidification, which leads to higher frequency of high acidity extremes. And we also have temperature changes and circulation changes, which leads to deoxygenation. So the increase of low oxygen extreme is probably also quite likely. So the processes leading to marine heat waves can also generate high acidity and low oxygen extremes, creating so-called compound extreme events. So that means when conditions are extreme for more than just one stressors. And there's a lot of evidence already that the impacts of these compound extremes are much more severe on organisms and ecosystems, but also on ecosystem services and human welfare than just univariate extremes such as a single heat wave. And we were actually wondering if the blob was actually not only a heat wave, was it actually a compound event? That's a figure from a paper which will come out soon, led by Nikki Gruber, where we run a regional model for this actually domain here. And we looked at the area affected by heat waves, that's in orange color. If you have heat wave and low oxygen extremes in red, if you have heat wave and high acidity extremes in purple, or if you have a triple compound extreme, if all three stressors are extreme at the same time. And what we actually found is actually the blob was not only a marine heat wave, it was actually a triple compound event with high acidity conditions and low oxygen extreme conditions. So it seems that the blob have created entirely novel conditions not experienced by the system, at least in the Northeast Pacific, in the past over the last few decades. And if we look, for example, at high temperature and high acidity extremes, where do they actually occur quite frequently? That's a map from a model simulations we have done. And if it's reddish, that means these events, these extreme events co-occur at the same time and in space quite frequently. And you can see it mostly in the subtropics and also in the higher latitudes, such compound extreme events occur quite frequently, whereas in the Eastern Equatorial Pacific, they occur almost never. That's for the present day. And if we go into the future for a 2-degree global warming world, actually the frequency of these compound events becomes quite high, actually. And even if you account for the mean shift in acidification and warming, when we get rid of that, you still get an increase in these compound extreme events, because also the variability, for example, in acidity increases quite strongly with increasing CO2. So to conclude, and an open question, so marine heat waves and ocean biogeochemical extreme events are becoming more frequent and severe in almost every region of the ocean. So there's almost no region which is not affected. And these trends are largely human-driven. So we can attribute the changes to human-driven, human-caused global warming. Triple compound events such as the blob emerge with conditions that are likely way outside anything the systems have experienced in the past. And I think one open question which we still have is, while we are making quite rapid progress with regard to quantify the hazards or the so-called ocean shocks, the understanding of the impacts of extremes on marine organisms and the ecosystem services and human welfare is still really poor at the moment. So we need a much better understanding here, and much more work has to be done here. Yeah, so that's it from my side.
Thank you, Thomas. And up next, we have Joey. Sorry, I just lost my place. Joey Bernhardt. Hello, there you are. You are speaking on biodiversity in the ocean, seafood, and human nutrition. And we are seeing your shared screen right now.
Let me just see here if I can put you in presenter view. Can you hear me all right?
Can hear you great, thanks. And that's perfect. You look good.
Move you over here, just one moment.
Joy, take your time.
Okay, well, I'm worried I'm gonna run out of time here, so.
No, don't worry, too much important thing, I'm learning.
Okay, okay, thanks, Yoshi. Yeah, thanks Constance and Yoshi and everybody else for inviting me to be here today. It's really a pleasure to be here and to tell you a little bit about what I've been working on in the past few years. So I'm an ecologist, but I want to first start by telling you that I'm joining you from the Pacific coast of Canada, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And for me as an ecologist and a biodiversity scientist, it's important to recognize that the biodiversity that exists within these traditional territories exists because of thousands of years of stewardship and effective management by Coast Salish people. And when you're looking at here in this photo is not any old stretch of shoreline. This is actually a clam garden, which is an ancient form of aquaculture that Coast Salish people use to maintain high levels of shellfish productivity and diversity in the intertidal zone. And the abundance of these shorelines is reflected in one of my favorite traditional Coast Salish sayings, which is, when the tide goes out, the table is set. And what I really like about this saying is that it evokes a living system in which human well-being and ecosystem health are intricately linked, not only through the food benefits provided by the shellfish, but also the cultural and spiritual benefits. The other component here, when the tide goes out, evokes a changing, living, dynamic coastal system. And we know that coastal ecosystems support human well-being and livelihoods around the world. And these systems are now experiencing a rapid planetary scale change.
And we know that this change is threatening the ability of these systems to support livelihoods as captured in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as we've heard about today. And so understanding how living systems at multiple scales respond to environmental change, including the human dimensions of these systems, is arguably the most important scientific challenge that we face over the next century. And this is the focus of my research program. So I aim to develop a mechanistic understanding of global change in the oceans and the consequences of these changes for seafood, for aquaculture, and human nutrition and health. We're now living in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, right? Where biodiversity is declining in many coastal ecosystems, and there's growing concern that these changes could directly impact human health. And so my research seeks to answer this question using biodiversity theory. So I approach this as an ecologist. So in ecology, biodiversity theory predicts that for species to coexist, and this is a theory that was originally developed for grasses on land, species must differ in their resource niches, which leads to complementarity in resource use among species. And this eventually leads to a positive relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. And this positive relationship we've observed in hundreds of experiments. And we've extended this understanding to ecosystem services, or the benefits that ecosystems provide to people. But most of these extensions have focused on yield. And there are actually very few robust links between biodiversity in natural systems and human health and well-being. Because of course we know that human health is not just a matter of understanding yields. And we know this is an example of this from Bangladesh, where some really nice work has shown that over a 20-year period, even though people consumed more seafood overall, they actually, micronutrient intake, so important nutritional benefits that people get from seafood, actually declined. So in spite of increasing seafood consumption, micronutrient intake declined, which leads to a problem known as hidden hunger. And so we know that the human health benefits that we get from seafood are not just a matter of understanding yields. And that's because seafood is an important source of protein and fat and calories in the human diet, but also these really important nutrients like the omega-3 fatty acids, as well as micronutrients like calcium, iron, and zinc. And so here we asked, does aquatic biodiversity actually enhance the nutritional benefits that we get from seafood? And I'll just illustrate this to you quickly here by showing you that we can envision a scenario of high biodiversity in the diet on the top panel and contrast that with a scenario of lower biodiversity in the diet. And from ecological principles and biodiversity theory, this would lead us to predict that increasing biodiversity in the diet should lead to enhanced nutritional benefits. And I'll just briefly tell you that we looked at two different dimensions of nutritional benefit here. The number of distinct nutrients within a particular portion that reach public health recommended dietary allowances. These are the minimum intake of a particular nutrient that are required to meet the health needs of a particular demographic of the human population. We also looked at the minimum portion size required to reach these recommended dietary intake guidelines. And so we predicted, based on biodiversity theory, that increasing biodiversity in the diet should lead to enhanced nutritional benefits, and this should lead to better health outcomes because a greater proportion of the human population will exceed this RDA, their recommended dietary allowances. So I won't get into the details here, but I'll just tell you that we assembled a very large data set of tissue, nutrient, and contaminant concentrations across 800 species. And we use biodiversity theory to test whether there's actually a benefit of increasing biodiversity in the diet for human health. So what we found is that biodiversity has benefits for micronutrients and fatty acids, but not for protein. And so I'll just show you this graph on the left here. In this case, lower numbers are better because what I'm plotting here is the minimum portion size required to reach a given nutritional target. And what you can see, I'll show you this yellow line here first. This is for protein. You can see that as species richness or biodiversity increases, there is no benefit to increasing biodiversity in the diet for protein. The minimum portion size required to reach a protein intake is the same across all levels of biodiversity. But that that relationship differs for the micronutrients, calcium, iron, and zinc. And in these cases, the minimum portion size required actually declines as biodiversity increases. And this is a benefit from the perspective of human health, because it means that people can reach their nutritional needs more efficiently. And this effect is even stronger when we consider all 5 micronutrients and fatty acids simultaneously, which is of course really important from the perspective of human health. We also found that increasing species richness increases the number of nutrient targets met per 100 gram portion. This is a really important component of the biodiversity benefits. We also found that, that this isn't just a matter of number of species in a particular ecosystem, it's also related to the diversity of functional traits like body size and diet within a particular system. So what that means is that aquatic ecosystems that contain a wider range of ecological roles also provide enhanced nutritional benefits. Okay, so to summarize, what we found is that biodiversity in the diet is critical to meeting micronutrient intake targets, but not for protein. And biodiversity is essential to meeting nutritional requirements efficiently. And this has really important implications when we think about balancing reaching sustainability goals for human health as well as life below water, because what that tells us is that restoring biodiversity in the oceans, minimizing biodiversity loss, will actually benefit ecological health as well as human health simultaneously. And I don't have time to get into this today, but we also looked at these patterns at local scales within traditional indigenous diets, as well as for contaminants like methyl mercury and lead. And so with that, I would just like to say thanks to my sources of funding and be happy to continue the conversation later.
Right. Thank you so much, Joey. I am learning so much from everybody here, and this makes me so happy and grateful to be part of this Ocean Nexus community. Up next, we have Becca Selden. We welcome you to the floor. You are presenting fishing community responses to species distribution shifts. Thank you, Becca.
Hi, everyone. You seeing my screen okay?
Yes, we do.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Dr. Becca Selden. I'm an assistant professor at Wellesley College, and today I'll be presenting my work on looking at how fishing communities are responding to shifting fishes. I'm motivated by a Tolkien quote here of "Not all who wander are lost." So warming oceans are driving a poleward migration as suitable habitat moves towards the poles. And as they do, fishing communities may lose the species that they've relied upon for decades, while others become newly available. In this talk, I will describe how fishing communities responded to those shifting distributions. Then I'll explore how those choices are constrained by both management and markets. And finally, I'll discuss what our results mean for making management more climate ready. So we looked at this in the Northeast US, where we were looking at trawl fishing communities along the Atlantic seaboard. And the two main responses we observed there were, the first one is to shift where they fished. So moving, in this case, northward to maintain fishing on this blue species. The second main response was to shift what they fish by shifting from the blue fish to the red fish. Now, how many communities do we actually see each of these responses? In many cases, the dominant paradigm that we hear is, oh, fishermen are mobile, they'll follow the fish. But we actually found only 1 of 14 focal communities actually had this response strategy as their dominant one. Instead, we found 12 of our 14 focal communities actually stayed where they'd fished for decades, and instead shifted what they caught in those same fishing grounds. So this suggests that catch diversity is going to play a really important role in resilience to shifting species distributions. Unfortunately, we also found that overall catch diversity is declining. So here I'm representing the catch diversity in the early period between 1996 and 2000 with this sort of collection of 4 colored fish. And over time, on average, all of our focal communities actually lost 25% of their catch diversity. So we take away our yellowfish in this case. In our most diverse communities, we actually found that they lost 50% of their diversity. So this is concerning because it suggests that this really key response strategy that these communities demonstrated is going to become more difficult as they become more and more specialized. Recently, we've also looked at how the fleet diversity has changed within these communities. So this was looking at how many different types of fishing or fishing fleets operate within a port. So here I'm showing you Wanchese, North Carolina, where the intensity of the color is how many trips are done in that particular fleet. And the different colors represent different gear groups or fleets as we've defined them. And so what you see, excuse me, in the sort of middle time period, we have a really large number of fisheries that are operating in this area. And then as we go across time to 2019, we're actually seeing less and less of those fleets continuing to operate until the last year in 2019, we really have most of the trips being comprised of this one yellow fleet. So this, you perhaps might have expected in this more southern port in North Carolina, but we are actually also seeing this in one of our largest ports in Massachusetts, where this is the one that has some of the biggest diversity in the fleets that are operating, also sees a decline in that fleet diversity, and now it's much more dominated by one type of fleet. So this is concerning because with fewer fleets in each port communities may be less resilient to climate variability, especially there's less potential for somebody to switch into a different fishing strategy, or it may actually result in lower resilience of other sort of port infrastructure that's important in that area that can support all of the fisheries. So in the context of shifting fish distributions, what constrains the options for adaptation? So here I'm showing you a hypothetical region where we have fish. The red fish are sort of straddling this man-made management boundary represented by the dashed line. And then we're showing you where two communities actually fish within the sea, the B fleet in the dashed blue circles and the A fleet in the red circles. And then we're representing the ports that they could land in by ports 1, 2, 3. Now, as the fish shift north, we have observed that actually there's a lot of constraints on where this fish can be landed that are due to management. So in some cases, you might have regulations that prevent fish from being landed in this new area. So they have to go back to that original port and not to this new port, even though that's closer to it. So we found that this particular constraint was occurring in the fishery for fluke. So this is, the landings are constrained by where they were historically fished and landed. And so this constrains the options for fisheries above this management boundary to actually take advantage of this new fish. In addition, some increasingly available fish can't be taken due to recovery plans. So dogfish is one of those examples. So they're flooding the fishermen's nets, but they cannot harvest them. Other newly available species like black sea bass also can't be harvested in these new regions because there's no quota. Finally, fishers need to buy permits for new species if they're under a different fisheries management plan. So all of these management constraints make it very difficult to pursue that strategy that we found was dominant, which was switching the species that they're catching. Economic constraints can also be layered on top of this. So I mentioned port infrastructure as being important. If that's not as mobile as the fishing fleet, you may not be able to harvest or land something in a new port. And finally, there may be less market for new species. So all of these are constraining some of the options, the realized options for fishers. So what solutions might there be to allow for more climate-ready fisheries management? So the first, I would argue, is to incorporate communities at sea to better project how a particular range shift is going to be manifest inside a specific fishing ground. So actually taking into account that Port A or Group A fishes in the red dashed lines, and that's different from the Fleet B. The second and maybe more controversial option is to consider a more area-based approach rather than a species-based one. And so this would allow some more flexibility in landing whatever is in the fishing grounds that are right off port of, in the purple or the red region. The second would be to develop more dynamic quotas to reflect the shifting species distributions. But as we're focused strongly on equity in this group, We also need to make sure that those equity concerns are considered in any reallocation scheme. And finally, as we know that these fish are shifting across boundaries, we should be proactive in actually creating cooperative agreements across those boundaries to reduce conflict. And this is, one way to get ahead of where we know that those fish are going to go from our physical models. With that, I will say thank you to the Nexus group for inviting me, and I look forward to further conversations. Thanks.
Thank you, Becca. From Becca Selden, we go to Rebecca Ash, who is presenting Secrets of the Southern Flounder, Spawning, Offshore Migration, and Larval Dispersal.
Okay, so I think that I need to open system preferences to get Zoom to share my screen, which I'm doing. This is going to, okay. I think I might need to quit and rejoin because of this. Sorry about that. I'll rejoin in a second, literally.
It's okay, Rebecca, take your time. Thanks for coming, good to see you.
Yoshi, would you like to move on to William's presentation, or should we give Rebecca a minute?
Yeah, William, are you ready?
Yeah, I can do that if you want to.
I think that'd be better. And Constance, would you let Rebecca know? So
I will.
Okay, thank you
Sounds
very
good.
much. So that means I'm gonna.
Oh wait, Rebecca's here.
Actually,
Okay,
in that
so
case, let's just do it.
yeah, sorry about that.
Not a problem.
I think it's just one of these Mac things where they demand to do that if you haven't used Zoom before with it, and we're actually a Teams university, so we have a different program.
There you go.
So I'm going to talk about the secrets of the southern flounder, and we're going to be focusing on spawning, migrations offshore, and larval dispersal. So you see, for a little bit of this, I want to talk about how this is connected to ocean governance and also social equity issues, because there are some connections, but they might seem indistinct. So the first thing is, if you're trying to impact environmental justice and these equity issues, it's often very important to work locally in the community that you're embedded in. So this kind of ties to why this project is focused in Eastern North Carolina, which is the area where I'm working currently. And this is also an area where a lot of these environmental justice issues are particularly key. It's an area that has high rural poverty rates and health disparities, and it's underserved as state level. It's also a home to many fishing communities, and at the state level, historically, the largest commercial and recreational finfish fishery is southern flounder, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. Unfortunately, this is a fishery that's both experiencing overfishing and has been overfished. And there's also some management and governance issues associated with this. In particular, a lot of the context to this research is that we had a stock assessment a couple of years back that was rejected because right now the fishery is managed at state level, but there's evidence of intermixing among basically states throughout the Southeast. This fish has been shown from previous conventional tagging to basically move southward, but what's uncertain is where it actually spawns and reproduces, because we know it leaves estuaries and goes offshore. But if it spawns when it's offshore before migrating south, you might actually have some life history completion within state boundaries. So this kind of motivates this project that we got funded to do through the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries. And part of the reason why I'm talking about it is it's also very different from my past Nereus work. So it gives you a sense of the diversity of things being done in my particular lab. It's also a big project. So I'm the lead principal investigator on it, but you can see that we have quite a few team members, both from East Carolina University, but also from UNC Wilmington and North Carolina State University. So the way that we're approaching this problem is to take a multi-pronged approach. And our kind of first approach to figure out where the southern flounder spawn and their migration history for this management goal of understanding that is to tag them acoustically and track that migration using acoustic receivers. So we are going to be tagging 200 fish. They're tagged in the estuaries, but since they migrate offshore and we have the Outer Banks, they all have to pass through a series of inlets. So we have 21 receivers placed at 7 inlets throughout the state. We also have an offshore array of receivers and also a wave glider that's being used to track their migration routes during a couple of missions each year. So we've done year 1 of tagging. Year 2 of tagging is set to begin in about 2 weeks, but we do have some initial results. Last year, we tagged 110 fish, and we got acoustic detections from 62 of them. And we're finding that their life history is much more complex than previously hypothesized. So when these flounders travel offshore, they're leaving through a wide variety of estuaries. Their migration is later than expected. What's believed is that they spawn at the edge of the continental shelf because historically there have been some early stage larvae observed there, and we have seen them travel to this hypothesized spawning area. But what's really interesting is their habitat use patterns are different than what was previously known. They seem to make these quick forays to that outer continental shelf area, but spend more time during winter when they're outside the estuaries in kind of coastal habitats. And you can see that in terms of this particular individual's movement patterns. Some individuals do return to North Carolina estuaries after going offshore. So we do have some life history completion within state waters. Some don't migrate at all, so we're discovering diversity of life history. And then so far, we've only seen one fish that seems to be moving southward, which is what people have previously seen with conventional tags. So with our other approaches, we're also relying on a over 30-year time series of larval fish that's run by the NOAA lab in North Carolina, in which our lab at ECU is very involved with. And we're looking at otoliths to age those fish. And then based on their ages, we can backtrack where the larvae were previously using a hydrodynamic dispersal model called CMS. So that's our second way that we're looking at kind of where these fish might be coming from and where they're spawning. Our third way is to actually do surveys for eggs. So we did 2 egg surveys last year. We have funding to do 4 to 6 of them this year. And then we're going to be doing DNA barcoding to ID those eggs because fish eggs are extremely difficult to identify morphologically. We're developing methods for that right now. We have about 4,000 eggs that we're going to be barcoding. And the last thing, and this is work of master's student Justin Mitchell, is we're going to be doing some kind of more traditional fisheries biology techniques, but the part that's really exciting about this objective is the Otolith Microchemistry. By looking at barium to calcium ratios and strontium ratios, you can figure out past salinities inhabited by fish, which will inform us of the offshore migration. And also, since the 3 estuaries all have unique salinity profiles, that will also tell us how much fidelity some of these fish have to particular estuaries. So I'm going to end there in hopes of keeping us more or less on time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you, everyone, for staying with us. We do have one more presentation. I know we are at the top of the hour, but I would like to welcome next William Chung, who will speak about the compound climate risks that threaten aquatic food system benefits.
Sorry, yes, thanks. Sorry, I just mute my mic. But good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak in this event. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Muslim nations. I'm at the UBC Vancouver campus now. I really appreciate that I can live and work in their land. I'm now the director and professor of the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries at the University of British Columbia. I was the director of science of the Nippon Foundation UBC Nereus Program. It is really wonderful to see many friends and colleagues in this meeting. Okay. My talk is based on a study that is part of the Blue Food Assessment Initiative, which is a collaborations between Stonecrop Resilience Center, the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, as well as many other colleagues around the world, including some of the colleagues in our institute. A component of the Blue Food Assessment is to bring together all these collaborators and scientists to study blue foods or aquatic foods. Some of the colleagues attending this meeting, including Thomas Frolicker and some others who are the attendees of these meetings, are also co-authors of these studies. The paper is just released last week. As the previous speakers have highlighted clearly, seafood or aquatic food in general is important for us as a source of food, livelihood, income, and culture. Over the last few decades, global demand for seafood has been increasing with continuous increase in consumptions per capita, as well as global populations increase. However, in the ocean, we have reached the peak fish as global capture fisheries catches peaked in the 1990s and then declined slightly, while the expansion of marine aquaculture or mariculture cannot yet further increase seafood production in recent years. Much of the expansions of mariculture is also concentrated in a few countries, such as China, or concentrated in the productions of high-value fin fish, such as salmon. And on top of that, the effects of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, including ocean warming, deoxygenation, and ocean acidification, among others, are affecting marine biodiversity, ecosystem functions, and services. This ultimately affects fisheries and the human communities that are dependent on them for food, livelihood, income, and culture. Existing climate assessment and projections focus largely on understanding how climate change would affect seafood production. Specifically, climate change is projected to result in large decline in maximum fisheries catch potential, as indicated by the red and orange color on the map, on the upper map, particularly under the high emissions, no mitigations policy scenario. Tropical oceans are expected to be hit hardest. Meanwhile, the variety of species that are suitable to be farmed in tropical coastal waters are also projected to decrease, as shown in the map on the lower part of the slide. These unequal impacts result in large global disparity in climate risk that seafood production sectors will be facing in the 21st century. However, seafood production is only a component of the complex aquatic food systems. There are many other intermediate components in the food systems that link productions to the multidimensional outcomes from aquatic food or blue food, such as nutrition and health, as Joey highlighted, economic, social, and environmental outcomes. These components also include those in freshwater and on land. These outcomes are impacted by multiple climatic hazards, not only through production system, but also through other components of the aquatic food systems. The entire food system is being impacted by multiple climatic hazards through different pathways. Our study accounts for the whole aquatic food systems holistically and examine how multiple climatic hazards will put global aquatic food systems at risk. We considered multiple hazards to the aquatic food systems. For example, marine fisheries must contend with shifting species distributions, shellfish production with ocean acidification, and inland fisheries with prolonged droughts that limit freshwater availability. In our analysis, the exposure of countries or territories to climatic hazards through their aquatic food systems is positively associated with their level of dependency on aquatic foods to support nature and people. For example, For nutrition and health outcomes, the indicators are per capita supply of marine and freshwater aquatic foods and the percentage of a nation's consumption of nutrients that is derived from these aquatic foods. I won't go into the details on each indicator, but I'll be happy to answer specific questions after my talk. To capture the vulnerability of aquatic systems outcomes to climatic hazards, we selected several variables that represent the adaptive capacity of aquatic food systems and the sensitivities of aquatic food systems outcomes in the face of climate change. We then use a physiologic algorithm to combine these attributes and compute index of risk of climate impacts on the food systems outcomes. What we find is that by the mid-21st century, marine fisheries hazards are classified as high in most of the tropical Africa, Central America, and Southeast America. With a bigger magnitude of warming on large continental land masses than in the oceans. Freshwater fisheries in some countries are also projected to face very high hazards by the mid-21st century, especially in water-stressed areas such as Northern Africa and the Middle East. Each country's climate vulnerabilities are dependent on factors such as their economic outputs and inclusion, strength of social services, and metrics of food security and environmental integrity. When these are taken into account, much of Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific face high to very high climate risk for one or more food system outcomes by the mid of this century under the high emission scenario. In terms of nutrition, this may equate to reductions in aquatic food access in populations that are already at thresholds for nutrient deficiency, especially if climate change drivers would put up food prices for households that are least likely to afford fish in their household. In contrast, most countries in North America and Europe, as well as in Chile, Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand, face low to medium climate risk across all food system outcomes for this period. A rapid reduction in carbon emissions can indeed avoid a substantial increase in climate risk for many countries by the end of this century. We did a cluster analysis of our modeling result, and we used the results to delineate 4 distinct climate risk profiles for countries that experience high risk in at least one food system outcome under the high emission scenario. For many coastal countries and the small island development states with high dependency on marine fishery sector and medium vulnerability, climate risk are concentrated in the nutritional health and or economic food system outcomes. Similarly, some countries, primarily in Eastern Europe, generally face low hazards and display medium vulnerability, but stand out for their poor environmental performance, leading to concentrated climate risk in the environmental dimensions of food system outcomes. Countries with high climate vulnerability are projected to face compound climate risk across 3 or 4 of the food system outcomes, either in marine fisheries or in freshwater and estuarine fisheries and aquaculture. These different risk profiles across countries and regions call for region-specific and context-specific risk reduction interventions. Overall, climate mitigation activities will substantially reduce climate hazards, as one would expect it. However, it is insufficient. Climate mitigation is insufficient to completely avoid the negative outcomes that we find from our study. Our study highlights the need to focus on the broader socio-ecological context for each country, with actions building resilience that extend beyond aquatic food production. These are some of the general examples that we should consider as we suggest to be considered as options for different local contexts, as shown in the second point of the slide. For example, for countries with high marine fisheries dependence, including many small island development states, one of the challenges will be to design measures that strike an appropriate balance between supporting economic development aspirations through efficiency and revenue generation and supporting food security through local and domestic consumption of fish. For countries where freshwater aquaculture contributes to poor environmental outcomes, solutions may target adoption of integrated farming solutions or technological innovations such as resource-efficient production systems that can be isolated from the environment. In both contexts, solutions need support through enabling government policies, functional institutions at the national, community, as well as international level to support sustainable, as well as relying on responsible financial investment as well. Overall, our study highlights the differences in climate risk profiles, and this call for resilient enhancing actions that are region-specific and context-specific and are guided by principles of equity and fairness. Most urgent are actions and investments for countries that face compound climate risk across multiple aquatic food system outcomes. Countries with low to medium risk will also face increasing climatic hazards domestically and are also connected to transboundary climate risk through, for example, species movement and trade of aquatic foods and inputs. Addressing climate risk on global aquatic food systems requires justice-informed collaborations towards climate proofing of aquatic food systems that transcends national and regional boundaries. With that, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, William, and thank you to all of our presenters for today. Andres, we're taking it back to you to close us out.
Thank you so much, William. Thank you, Constance. Obviously, thank you all so much for joining us today. I can't get over how much I miss everyone. So funny, but yeah, I mean, it was really, really nice to hear about what everyone's doing. It's been a weird last couple of years, but we definitely have a lot of plans to get everyone together in person. Hopefully that can be one huge meeting. If it can't be that soon, it'll be a lot of smaller meetings. And before we go, I'd just like to say how happy I am to be part of this group. And I think a lot of us share that, and having come from Nereus, which was very much centered on this very high level science with a lot of relevance for the global oceans. And now with Nexus really being able to center that more fully on equity and justice, and seeing everyone having sort of come with us along the way. And in the future, for those of you who are part of Nereus, reach out to us. We're always happy to engage in workshops and collaborations. If you aren't part of Nereus or Nexus, we're also super happy to work with you. And you can always find us on our website to see where we are. And I'm really happy that we can have this platform to really go after justice and equity in a way that's transformative, unapologetic, and with the highest level of science helping us along the way. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Constance, so much for keeping us on track and on time. And yeah, reach out to us. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys all soon.
Thank you, everyone. So good to see you.